Hey English 345 students, welcome to this screencast that gives you a little bit more explanation about section 6.1 or 6.1, which is part of chapter 6 in Essentials of Linguistics. And so this week we're going to be beginning the subfield of linguistics called morphology. Last week and the week before you were studying phonetics, mainly the area of articulatory phonetics. Now we're going to take the sounds, that is really like the building blocks of words, and we're going to look at how we take pieces of words, put them together to create different categories of words, different meanings with words. And so we're going to start with this foundational lecture about words and morphemes. So what I'll do is go through the reading that you should go ahead and do yourself, and I'm going to kind of focus on the words that are in bold in this reading and kind of give you some more perspective, a little bit more information about each one of those concepts. Well, the first thing I think is important to look at is just this first question right here. What's a word? And like Anderson says in this reading, it does almost seem a little bit silly to ask that question because it's like everybody knows what a word is, right? We use them all the time. We use them to put together sentences. They are in our head all the time every time we're thinking about a concept. So it does seem like something really obvious. And as she quotes here, the famous linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, or Ferdinand de Saussure, if you want to say it with a more English pronunciation, said that a word is like a coin because it has two sides to it that can never be separated. And the two sides that he was talking about, one is form, the form of a word, so the sounds or the letters that combine to make the spoken or written word. So, how do we actually put a word together? Which letters do we need to spell that word? Which pieces do we need to put together to create that word? That would be the form. The other part that he was talking about was meaning. So what kind of like image comes into your mind when you hear that word? And there can be so many different meanings even attached to a single word. It depends on the context in which the word is used. Some words can have the same pronunciation but have a completely different meaning in different contexts. One that comes to mind is like if you were to say lead versus lead, or lead and lead. Let's see, L-E-A-D and L-E-D. They might have different spellings, but they have the same sound and they're used in completely different ways in different contexts. Even let's say I read the book versus I read the book. Those are words that have the same spelling, are pronounced differently, but have completely different meanings in different contexts. We have lots of words like that in English, and other languages have similar situations too. And even in addition to those examples I just explained, another way to think of this would be the social context in which you use a word, or the way the meaning of a word would change over time. I know one of you mentioned in one of the discussion forums that the word crackhead has taken on a completely different meaning, and that one really caught my attention because me growing up in the 80s and 90s, a crackhead was a person addicted to an illegal drug, and it was a really negative term. And now it seems like crackhead is a much more positive meaning, and I even hear my own children use that word with a really positive meaning, like someone who's really good at something in a video game, or someone who has lots of energy or something like that. It's a very different meaning from what I remember. So the meanings of words also change over time. Okay, now let's look down at our next paragraph here. And one way that we're going to be thinking of words is that they're free. So if we're talking about individual words, if you look at a sentence and kind of look at the words that are in that sentence, words can exist on their own. They have their own independent meaning. They can appear in isolation, as we see here. So if we look at some of these example sentences that Anderson gives to us in this chapter, okay, she asks several questions, and then you can give individual words as answers to those questions. And it's completely grammatical to do that. We don't go around answering each other in complete sentences all the time, right? Like if somebody asks you, "What are you doing?" you're not always going to say, "I am cooking." You probably wouldn't ever say that. You would just say cooking. It's an individual word. It can exist on its own in isolation. It's a free form. It doesn't have to be attached to anything else. Okay, what are you cooking? Soup. Again, soup can exist here in its on its own. It doesn't have to be attached to anything else. How does it taste? Delicious. Can I have some? No. And these are all different types of words too. Like cooking implies an action, right? The ing on the end implies that this is continuous. It's going on for a little while. And you'll see as we get a little bit further into this explanation about words and morphemes that that ing ending carries a lot of meaning. Soup is a noun. It's a thing that you eat, of course. So that can also be a one-word answer. It can exist by itself. Delicious, it's an adjective. So we're describing the way the soup tastes. This also can exist in isolation by itself. And even no, okay, is just giving somebody an affirmative or negative answer. That doesn't even have to be attached to anything either. Okay, another characteristic of words, as Anderson explains to us, is that they are movable. So depending on the language we're talking about, some word order is more movable than others. In English, our word order is pretty fixed. If you study a language like Latin, there's a little bit more movability because there are lots of endings on words that allow you to be able to move words around in a sentence and the sentence still makes sense. But if we look at an English sentence, like this first one right here, Penny is making soup, this is the classic example of an SVO sentence in English. What do I mean by SVO? Subject plus verb plus object. That's the standard word order in an English sentence. Other languages use other word orders. Some languages are SOV, subject, object, verb. So the object will come before the verb. Other languages are OSV. The object comes first, the subject in the middle, and the verb at the end. And others are even VSO, verb, subject, object. But for now, we'll just focus on English and its subject, verb, object, word order. So Penny, of course, is our subject. Is making, it's a compound verb. It means it's made up of two parts. We have a helping verb is and the present participle making. I call it present participle because ing indicates that something is happening now and it's ongoing, it's continuous. So in English, we call that either the present continuous or the present progressive tense. It can go by either term. But that's a tense that basically shows us that something is ongoing. So it's our verb. Together, it is our verb. Soup is the object. It's the object of the verb is making. So this is the classic example of an SVO sentence in English. Okay, soup is delicious. Soup is our subject. Is the verb. But in this case, delicious, the adjective, it's really referring all the way back to the subject, like describing the subject in some way. So that's another type of sentence we might see in English. And I love to eat soup. Okay, again, we have here the subject I, the verb love. To eat soup, we have the verb to eat. Soup is the object of that verb. When it's cold outside, this is another sentence on its own over here. It's cold outside. It is cold, another sentence. When is a conjunction that's joining those two sentences to get together to form a complex sentence. Okay, so despite all of that explanation of word order, this is something we'll come to in a little bit more detail when we get to Module 4, which is syntax, but it's giving you a little preview to that. So another thing we can say about words, however, is that they are movable. They can happen or they can occupy different positions in a sentence. So soup is the example we're looking at here. Soup is the object of the verb is making in the first sentence. It is the subject of the sentence in the second example. And it's another object over here in the third example. So we can take words and move them around and put them in different places. They can fill different roles in the sentence. They can even be different parts of speech sometimes. Like the verb run, for example. Running is my favorite activity. It's in the subject position. In that example sentence, it would be a noun. If you say she is running every morning, is running in that case would be a verb in the present continuous or present progressive tense. So words can occupy different kinds of positions in a sentence and function in different ways. Okay, so in other words, words can be moved around in a sentence. Another thing Anderson tells us about here is that words are inseparable. Okay, so we can't really break them up and put other pieces inside of them. So if you look at a word like carrots and Penny cooked some carrots, you can't really split up carrot and the plural ending s because it wouldn't really make any sense. You can't move that around in the word. So you couldn't say Penny cooked some cars rot. It doesn't make any sense, right? So the example underneath is kind of an interesting way of looking at that too. Penny bought 2 vegetable peelers. These seem like separate words, right? So vegetable is almost like an adjective describing the types of peelers. But you couldn't really take that S and then stick it on vegetable and say vegetables peeler. I mean, she says it's totally impossible to say. Penny bought 2 vegetables peeler. No, it doesn't work. It's completely ungrammatical. I guess if you said a vegetables peeler, it doesn't sound entirely terrible, but I don't think anybody would really ever say that way. Even though you are peeling multiple and plural vegetables with that peeler. Okay, so basically the concept there is that we can't separate words. Okay, we can't just take pieces like suffixes and prefixes and move them around within words. It won't work. Okay, all right, so we've seen that a word is a free form that has a meaning. It can stand by itself. It can exist in isolation. It doesn't have to be connected to something else necessarily unless you need to express a more complex idea in the form of a whole sentence. Okay, but now we need to move on to what is a morpheme. We know what a word is. We know it has meaning. We know it has a form. We know it can exist in isolation. We know that we don't break it up into separate parts and move the parts around because it wouldn't be the same word anymore. But now we need to move on to the concept of a morpheme. So a morpheme is the smallest form of a word that has meaning. Some of these morphemes are free. So you can pick any word that can exist in isolation, like cat or man or book or blanket, and that's a morpheme. It's a free morpheme because it can exist by itself. It doesn't have to be attached to something else to have a meaning, and you can move it around within a sentence. So that is a free morpheme. So the other category of morpheme that we have is the bound morpheme. So let's take a look at the next sentence and kind of break down what we mean by a bound morpheme. So penny, we can't divide that word up any farther, right? It's a name. We just can't do anything with it. It's a free morpheme. It can exist in isolation. It has meaning on its own. We know it's talking about a person. Cooked, this one's a little different though. We have the word cook, which is a verb, of course, but notice that there's something else attached to the end of this word. Cook is a verb, and if we look at it in isolation, we know it's an action of some kind. But this ed ending gives it some additional meaning, right? It's no longer just the action of cooking. It's now an action that happened when? In the past, right? So ed is our regular past tense verb ending. We know when we see ed, automatically something happened in the past. In fact, when you hear a child who's learning to speak English, maybe a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old child, they will say things like, I goed to the store yesterday, or I seed my friend across the street. Why do they do that? That's called overgeneralization when a child is first learning a language. And what they're doing is kind of sorting out the rules in their head. Like they have come to realize, even at that very young age, at 2 or 3 years old, that ed means past. Nobody taught the child that, of course. They picked it up just by exposure. So they know in their mind that there is a regular rule and a pattern that they can follow. And eventually, when they get more input of the language from their parents, from their caregivers, teachers, all the people around them, they filter out those irregular forms and they know, oh, okay, it's not goed, it's went. They might get that by direct correction, or they might get it just by listening, just by exposure. For the most part, it's exposure. Okay, so we know that that is another piece of the word. Can ed exist all by itself? No, you couldn't just answer that to a question, right? If you go back up to these examples we looked at in the beginning, what are you cooking? You can't just say ing and it won't have any meaning, right? The ing can't exist by itself. If you asked, what did you do yesterday? You can't just say ed for ed, it wouldn't make any sense, right? So the ed has to be attached to a verb for it to have meaning. So now we're kind of getting the idea of what a bound morpheme is, right? It's a piece of a word that has meaning, but it can't exist by itself. It has to be connected to a word, a verb in this case, to take on its meaning. Okay, let's go down a little further so we see the sentences we need here. Some is a word that can exist by itself. Okay, it doesn't have to be attached to anything else. It's an adjective, like showing us quantity. So we're not talking about everything or nothing, it's some. So we know the number of carrots we're talking about here is just a partial quantity. When you look at the word carrot, okay, carrot can exist by itself. It's a noun, it's a vegetable. Okay, but if we want to talk about more than one carrot, we need to add an ending to that, right? So this S ending, again, cannot exist by itself. If somebody asked you, what are you eating? You can't just say, S, right? It wouldn't make any sense. It needs to be attached to something else. And so you add that S ending in this particular case to show that there is more than one carrot. So again, we're looking at an example of a bound morpheme. So looking at the definition up above, a morpheme is the smallest form that has meaning. So a morpheme, if it's a free morpheme, could be an entire word that has a meaning. It can exist in isolation. It can move around in a sentence. But now a bound morpheme, these are morphemes that can only ever appear when they're attached to something else. And that's what we're looking at with the ed ending and the S ending. These cannot exist unless they're attached to something else. That's where they get their meaning from. Okay, so that's our first examples of bound morphemes. All right. Let's take a look at some other examples here. All right. So as I already mentioned, we can think of several other examples where that form has meaning, the ed form. I've already told you about the example of children who realize this at a very young age. So walked, baked, cleaned, kicked, kissed. Ed appears consistently in this form, and it always has the same meaning, but it never appears in isolation. So if you said, for example, if someone tells you, I need you to walk the dog, you can't just answer ed to indicate that you already walked the dog. You have to have walk and ed together to express that meaning. The same thing with the S or ES morpheme, bound morpheme. It can be attached to many words: carrots, bananas, books, skates, cars, dishes, many others. You can't have it in isolation. It's also a bound morpheme. All right, going a little bit further, we can talk about words as morphologically simple or monomorphemic. Mono, as you may already realize, is a Greek origin prefix that means one, kind of like the word monotonous or monotone. So if we add it to morphemic, in this case, we get the word monomorphemic, meaning one morpheme. So if a word is made up of just one morpheme, like banana, swim, hungry, we say it's morphologically simple or monomorphemic. If we were to add an S to the end of banana, bananas, it would no longer be monomorphemic. It would be what we're going to see below, polymorphemic, having more than one morpheme. Swim, we could add different endings to this as a verb. You could say he swims. So that S ending is not the plural S, it's a different S. It's a third person singular agreement S, because you can't say he swim. That wouldn't be grammatical in standard American English. So we have to have that S there to be grammatical in that dialect. I could say he swam. In that case, I cannot add an ed, right? That's in irregular form. I can't say he swimmed. That doesn't sound right. So that would be an example of an ed ending that a child would eventually get over time. They would realize that ed doesn't work there, even though you would think it would. Hungry, okay, is an adjective. We can add morphemes to that too. You could say she is hungrier than he is. So if we're comparing two people, we can add an er ending to show that comparison. So that's another kind of bound morpheme. So lots of ways we can change and adapt words and put them in different categories and assign them even different meanings. Okay, so you already have the idea of morphologically simple or monomorphemic, and I just mentioned earlier the concept of polymorphemic. So that means that a word is made up of a root plus one or more affixes. What do I mean by affixes? This is the general term for all the different kinds of bound morphemes we can add to words. In English, we are familiar with suffixes and prefixes, right? Suffixes come at the end of a word, prefixes come at the beginning of a word. In other languages, there are things called infixes. Okay, but first let's look at a few examples of suffixes. So in books, teaching, happier, hopeful, singer. All of these have suffixes, and all of these suffixes give these words extra grammatical information, or they change the category of the word. And in further lessons later this week and next week, you'll actually take these bound morphemes and subdivide those into two other categories. We won't get into that yet, but that is coming. So books, this bound morpheme is making the word plural. Teaching, this ing bound morpheme or suffix, it could be making this into a continuous verb, like she is teaching every day. It could be turning it into a noun, like teaching is the best profession in the whole world. So ing can serve different purposes. Happier, this er ending is making it a comparative form, so the children are happier than the dogs are. Hopeful, the ful suffix here is turning the noun hope into the adjective hopeful. And er here is not a comparison, but it's changing the category of the word. Sing is a noun, but if you add er to it, now it's the person who does that activity. Of course, we also have lots of prefixes in English, another category of bound morpheme. So unzip, it makes it the opposite, right? Reheat means to do that activity again. Disagree makes this opposite. Impossible also makes it opposite. We have several of these prefixes that turn a word from its affirmative into its negative meaning. And sometimes it has to do with pronunciation. That's why we choose one or the other. Imagine saying something like imagree. It sounds really kind of strange. Or unpossible. I guess it's possible you could pronounce it, but it sounds really unusual, right? Okay, and as I mentioned just a second ago, there are some languages that have a different kind of affix, so we can put suffix, prefix, and infix all into this category called affixes. Infixes are pieces of words, bound morphemes, that come somewhere in the middle of a word. So the language of the Philippines, Tagalog, uses infixes to express grammatical meaning. So the word for run, for example, I guess you would pronounce it as takba, but if you want to make it past, you have to add this little bound morpheme into the middle of it. So it would become tamakba, and that changes it from run to ran. Lakad, walk, becomes lamakad. You're adding the same bound morpheme, just like we would in English with ed. It just goes in a different place in the word instead of at the end. Bili, to buy, becomes bumili. No, we put that bound morpheme in the middle. It becomes bought. And eat, kain, becomes kumain, and that changes it from present tense eat to past tense ate. Okay, in English, it might seem like we don't have any infixes. We do have some. For example, let's see if I can pull up a quick document here, maybe even our, I'll just open up a new document and I'll give you a few examples of some infixes. So if I were to say apso, you could probably think of some choice words that you could put in the middle of that, right? If I were a British person, maybe I'd say something like abso-bloody-lutely. It doesn't sound bad to me. It doesn't sound like a curse word because I'm not a speaker of British English, but probably to a British person that might not be the best way to say that for social reasons, right? But it is possible for us to take a word that we know as a single free morpheme, split it up and put another word in the middle of it. There are probably other words you could think of to put in the middle of that word that I won't say on air, but they are kind of like examples of infixes in English. So the difference between an infix in a language like Tagalog and a language like English is that in Tagalog they serve a grammatical purpose. So the word completely changes meaning or has a different grammatical meaning based on that infix. By contrast, if I put another word inside of an existing word in English, we do it usually for slang or an informal way of saying something. So the process is similar, but the meaning is very different. Okay, so I hope this gives you a great overview of all the different ways we can think about the structure of words, the different types of morphemes, that a word is a free morpheme, that words also have other pieces attached to them called bound morphemes, and that within those bound morphemes we also have affixes, we can call them affixes, and those are divided into prefixes, suffixes, and infixes, which we don't generally have in English. But this will really prepare us well for when we're moving on to other types of morphemes that we'll begin talking about more like getting into next week. So we'll take the bound morphemes and we'll subdivide them into some other categories. But for now, just know how words are put together, the difference between a free morpheme and a bound morpheme, and we'll get a little bit more into bound morphemes next week.